dad's side of the family migrated to the area where our church is when they moved here from the South. So a lot of my family is from the Boot Hill, Missouri, parts of Arkansas, Tennessee, and Mississippi. And where they moved to around our church, of course, historically was kind of the first place where African Americans could live in the late 50s because housing covenants wouldn't let them live across Grand on the what's considered west. So in the late 60s, it was considered a big deal. They called it moving way west when they moved across Grand close to Union because housing covenants wouldn't let you do that. So my parents, they move here, they connect, they get married. Each of them came into the marriage with a child, my older brother and older sister. My sister's 11 years older than me. My brother was 10 years older than me. My brother was murdered 2 years ago. I'll talk about that a little bit as well. And so then I come along, and I become the annoying little brother to these two soon-to-be teenagers. And then my mom took ill when I was about 3 years old. She battled with kidney. So when she was diagnosed in 1979 with her kidney challenges, they did not call it kidney disease then. They said it was just kidney failure. She had a transplant. She had a transplant in 1982. And at the time that she had her transplant, to give you a little St. Louis history, the only hospital that had the capability to do it was the Veteran Hospital on North Grand. My mom was a patient at Mercy for a long time, thus part of the connection we have and why our resource center has a Mercy clinic. But Mercy even then did not have the capabilities. And so they granted special rights to our family because no one in our family, at least our immediate family, my mom or dad were veterans. And so my mom has a transplant. She starts to do well. She comes home for my 6th birthday, surprised me because she had been in the hospital. I did not know she was coming to my 6th birthday party. My dad did his best at throwing this together. Men, dads, and we thank for our wives because, they just are better at that than us. But my dad did great. My mom comes home. We take a picture together. We celebrate. A couple of months later, her body rejected both kidneys. She went back in the hospital, lived in the ICU for about 7 months, and then passed away in October of 1983. So I say that to you tonight, that shaped my faith from this perspective. When I was a kid after my mom passed, I wanted nothing to do with God. Everything everybody ever said about God being good to me sounded like a screech. Because I said if God was good, he would not take a 6-year-old little boy's mom. He would not allow her to live in and out of hospitals for 3.5 years and then allow her to die. And I grew up in a very traditional Black Baptist church, which meant that if you did anything wrong, you were going to hell. And all I heard as a kid was if I wanted to see my mom again, live right. Just live right. When my mom's funeral came, again, I look back on it now, well-intended people. They really did love us. They just didn't know how to communicate in these moments. They said to me, well, your mom is just asleep. So you know what that did to me? For a year after my mom's funeral, I would not go to sleep without all the lights on and without passing out. Because in my mind, when you said sleep, and the God who takes people, because that's how I refer to God, he's the person who takes people away that you love, and if you go to sleep, he will take you. So I had insomnia. You add to the fact that when my mom passed, my sister is 16 going on 17, so she's battling teenage years. My dad had been the only dad in her life since she was a year old, but yet he was struggling to figure out how do I become this parent that I need to be for a teenage girl when all the outside influences are telling her, well, technically this is not your dad, and your mom had an inheritance and it should have went to you and not to him. So you had all this swirling around our house, And all church people would say is keep praying and God will, take care of you. So for me, God was not a good God. God was not nice. I stopped kind of going to church 9 or 10 years old. My mom was our connection to church. My dad was the stay-at-home dad on Sundays because for him, he figured if I'm not living according to the Bible, at least what I don't want to do is just show up and be a hypocrite. Now, he kind of hid behind that. We talked about that and joked about that as we got older before he passed away. But so I then began to disconnect from church. The only link I had was my grandparents. My grandfather was a deacon in this church, served there for many, many years, and my grandmother was a part of the choir. So I became that child who showed up on Mother's Day, Christmas, and Easter. And I did that to appease my grandmother. And then when I became a teenager and started driving, my grandmother would say stuff like, I need a ride to church today. Well, I knew the church had a church van. And so I would say, why do I have to come, which seemed to me very far, because my grandmother lived North City. I lived in North County at that point. For a while, for a season, when I was a kid, I lived with my grandparents because my dad worked nights, and he worked under a system that had a union, and the union said you could not move up in seniority until you put in enough years. So I lived with my grandparents during the week and lived at home in the weekend, so it gave me this hybrid thing going. And my grandmother knew that, so I had many friends in the city. And she would say, well, come see your friends and take your grandmother to church. And I say, fine. I mean, who's going to tell your grandmother, no, I'm not going to take you to church, right? So I take her to church. We pull up in front of the church. And like clockwork, she would say, I wish you were coming in with me. And I would say, I'll get around to that. And she would kiss me on the cheek and say, I love you. And I would watch her walk up the steps to New Covenant Missionary Baptist Church, where the Right Reverend J.A. Winston was pastor, and walk in for her Sunday sermon and a couple of hours of time in worship. You fast forward again, I graduate from high school, I'm top of my class, I go to Mizzou, but I still have this anger in my heart about who God is. And so at school, I always did well academically. I never struggled academically. Part of it, I believe honestly, was the chip that I carried on my shoulder because being raised by a single African-American male, you hear stories about single African-American women raising children. I can tell you it's a whole nother level of assumptions, stereotypes, poor treatment of black men who raise their kids and end their kids' lives. My dad heard it all. And the last thing I wanted to do was make life harder for him. So I excelled at school sometimes at the detriment of enjoying life because I never wanted it to be that my dad was the dad who couldn't handle raising his children. When my dad did come to church sometimes, people would say to him, especially some of the women in the church, oh, we're willing to help, if you need cooking or cleaning or this or that. Well, my dad was under my grandmother, he was the youngest of 7 children. My grandmother had him when she was 39, my grandfather was 44. My dad knew how to cook, clean, sew, do all that stuff, right? And you add to that, my dad went into hyper mode when my mom died because he's 38 years old, he's a young widow, and my dad was the type would have to die first before he would go to a doctor. My mom was the type, if she sneezed, she went to the doctor. So he always figured, he told me, he said, I always figured that I would pass before your mom. It rocked his world that my mom passed away first. So by the time I was 10, I could sew, I could cook, I could clean. I had my own key. I let myself in and out of our home, carried the alarm code, knew where all my dad's bills were, knew how much they were. I could run our household. Because in his mind, if something happened to him, he wanted me to be able to stand on my own. So I carried that with me. Now, you fast forward, I get into college, right? I'm doing well. And still, me and God are in this, what I call tug of war, not knowing that God always wins. And I get to my senior year in college, and I'm pretty worn out mentally. I'm worn out from doing well in the classroom and partying. I'm worn out from knowing some of those things that my grandparents instilled in me about who God is and who Jesus is, and not living the life that I should. And so I kind of came to the end of my rope my last semester. At this point, I'm on the dean's list in the School of Engineering at Mizzou, and I have some job offers before me. And one of them was here in St. Louis, and one was in Kansas City. I knew if I came to St. Louis and some of the friends that I had, that would not be good for me to be making a lot of money and young. So I took the job in Kansas City for Hallmark Cards. And a lot of people say, Hallmark Cards and engineers. Well, they have manufacturing facilities and distribution facilities, and they need controls and automation. And so I became an engineer and got into those things because, catch this, I did not want to deal with people. I didn't want to deal with God, and I didn't want to deal with people. And I said, if I can program robots and machines, they'll do what I want them to do. They won't talk back to me. They won't have a bad day. They won't call off sick. They won't argue with me. They'll just do what I want them to do, and I get to go home. Beautiful thing. Well, I go there, I'm doing this, and I get to Kansas City, and I'm out with a friend. This is where my faith really shifted. I'm out with a friend who I got to know in college. We became close. He lived in Kansas City. I would spend my weekends at his house. His mom was a great cook, loved cooking for us. And we would party all on the weekends. I'm just being honest, we would. And so we were out at a place on a Saturday night, and it was very clear to me that it was God saying, okay, it's time for you to come out of here. You need to go home. And I went to my friend and said, we got to leave. And we only been at this place maybe 15, 20 minutes. And he goes, what do you mean we need to leave? I said, I just know that we're not supposed to be here, and we got to go to church in the morning. He said, what? He said, okay. So we get in my car, we leave, I drop him off, I go home. And then when I get home, I was picking up the phone to call him, he was calling me. This is 2, 3 o'clock in the morning. He says, okay, so what church are we going to? I said, that's a good question. Because God didn't say what church, he just said you need to go to church. So we pick a church that's near his house so that I could park at his house and we could walk to church. It's 2 minutes away. The church, large Methodist church that Congressman Emanuel Cleaver II is pastor, okay? So we go, this is February 13th, 2001, day before Valentine's Day. And the church was having what they call Love Sunday to celebrate being loving and compassionate for Valentine's Day. We go, and when we get there, we recognize a couple of faces from Mizzou. And they kind of looked at us and were looking like, you guys smell like you've been out like last night. And so they kind of step away from us. And we looked at them thinking about all the times we've seen them at parties, but before we could even get sidetracked, a lady, this beautiful lady who we learned later was 87 years young, walks out in front of them, looks at them with an eye like, I'll deal with you later, turns to us and says, good morning, young man. I'm so glad you came to church this Sunday. Would you be my guest and sit with me and my family? She didn't know us. We didn't know her. But again, this bright, smiling face, who could say no to that? So we go in, we sit next to her, we listen to the message, and I said, I don't know if this is a church we're going to join, Dennis, but I think we got to keep this church thing going on Sundays. And so for the next 3 months, we went to a different church every Sunday of different faith practices, if you will. So we went to Methodist churches, Baptist churches, AME, Catholic, you name it. We went the gamut and just learned about the different traditions. We learned about the people there and how they view God. So God is stirring up in me this whole idea of drawing closer to him. And so at the end of it, kind of our church tour, we called it, I said, Dennis, there's a lady here who was great friends in Kansas City, but lived in St. Louis, was great friends with my grandmother. She's still living. Her husband was a pastor. He had passed away. The church that we all attended in St. Louis, I called, they connected me to her. Her name was Sister Paul. And I went to Sister Paul's church, and I never looked back. I started going, was there a few months, working with Pastor Porter, started teaching Sunday school. And then again, God just keeps poking. And it's like, I'm supposed to be doing more. I don't know what the more is. And so one Sunday after Sunday school, Pastor Porter says to me, have you been praying about what God is stirring up in your heart? Now, I hadn't said anything to him. So now I'm freaked out. Because keep in mind, even though I'm getting closer to God, God is still not my friend in my mind. Right? I'm going, what do you mean? He says, oh, give it time. Long story short, I came to him about a month and a half later and said, I think I'm supposed to be learning how to preach. And he just smiled and he said, I was waiting for you to catch up to what God was doing. And so I come back to St. Louis, I visit my grandparents' church and fellowship. I said if I got baptized, I always wanted to be baptized there. So I got baptized in my grandparents' church and went back to Kansas City and just dug in and started serving youth and all that good stuff. In the meantime, me and my wife reconnect, get married. We're living in Kansas City. And we're there about 1.5 years, and God comes calling again about, okay, you need it back in St. Louis. Now, keep in mind, I never wanted to move back to St. Louis because of my painful memories about God and losing my mom here, but also because I felt like St. Louis would stifle what I wanted to do career-wise. Because at this point, I'm still an engineer. I'm making good money. I'm living a good life. But we both prayed about it, me and my wife and I, and so we move. We leave there. It was very hard for me to leave Kansas City because Greater Emmanuel Missionary Baptist Church became my home. It became a trusted place where I feel like I got back in good graces with God. That's how I saw it, but in reality, it was a point there that God was really shaping and working on my heart because it was hard. And we moved back here. We started attending the church where my wife grew up, and the pastor was recovering from an aneurysm. And he said, I need help. And I was like, okay, I can help around here on the weekends. And he had something else in mind that I wasn't ready for, which was working for the church. And I said, oh, no. I said, I'm going to be honest with you. You guys can't afford me. I know, some of you would never say that to a pastor. I did. I said, no. I make a lot of money, and, I'm only 2 years into this marriage, and I'm really trying to stay married, so no. And he said, okay. So here's what happened. I then have to step away from this job, do the job I had, because of some of the things I saw that weren't morally right. And I can say it now because the place is no longer in business. Anybody ever remember L'Ecole Culinaire being right around here? Oh, yeah. Sure. I worked for Vatterott and I helped build L'Ecole Culinaire. I used to travel around for them opening up campuses. And I learned their practices about how they recruited students. And once I learned their practices, I said, there's no way as a believer I can work here. And I stepped away from it. Not knowing that a few years later they would get in trouble and eventually be out of business. And so during that time of stepping away, I was spending time with Pastor Smith. And long story short, after a while, sure enough, they came to me about working with him as he was recovering. And I sensed God saying, do it. At the same time, I had a job offer on the table that was in Tampa Bay, Florida. 30 minutes away from the beach. Offered to buy the house we were living in. They were offered to give us down payment on a new house. We could live in assisted housing for a year. I mean, a great relocation package. And I thought, okay, now that's God. Now I'm in. And I go home and tell my wife about it. She said, no, I think we're really supposed to stay here. She's pregnant with our daughter at this time. My son is 2 years old. And she says, no, I think we're supposed to stay. And I'm thinking, oh, that's just the pregnant hormones talking. I'll wait a few days. And so I went back to the company that was offering the job and said, I need a little more time to evaluate this. They said, sure, we'll give you an additional 2 weeks. No rush. 2 weeks later, I bring it back up. She says, no, I really think we're supposed to stay. I went, oh, Lord, the woman you gave me. No. But long story short, she was right. We stay. The company thinks I've lost my mind. They said, you're going to do what? I said, I'm going to work for a church. I never forget the guy looked at me and said, here's my number. When that doesn't work, you call me and I'll give you this job. And he held the job open for like 3 months. And so every time I hit a snag or something with that church, it was like, man, Tampa's got to be calling. Tampa's got to be calling. And I knew in my heart, though, that wasn't it. Now, keep in mind, the reason why I said snag is because after I took this role in the church, 2 weeks later, the pastor resigned. He and the elders had been at odds for quite some time. No one bothered to tell me that. He shows up on a Sunday morning. I walk in his office, and in Black Baptist structure, some of them, the chairman of deacons is like the lead person in the church. He's with the chairman of deacons, sitting at a table, and says, yeah, he's resigning today. Today is going to be his last day. He won't preach this morning. You'll have to preach. I'm 29 years old, and that became my first pastoral assignment. And so many people left with him that day because they thought that the young guy pushed out the older guy. And with St. Louis being the big little town, it spread. And so I would go places, and they would say, yeah, that's that guy who pushed Pastor Smith out. It was cold, it was hard, and it began to remind me again of my childhood. And I started really asking where God is in this. And then during the middle of all that, my daughter is born. A day later, she starts having seizures. We don't know why. She's transported from MOBAP to Children's Hospital in a moving hospital, mobile hospital. She ended up living in the NICU for 3.5 months. And we found out later, years later, through technology, that she has KCNQ2. That is a chromosome that did not duplicate properly. Nothing mom did or anybody did, it just happens. It's very rare, roughly 1,200 kiddos in the United States. There's a foundation that's been doing work to trying to find out more because some kiddos it impacts slightly and some more severe like my daughter. So like tonight, I have my phone on vibrate. She's at home with our aide. She's a 16-year-old in every sense of the word, okay? Girl, choicey, bossy, all of that. Limited speech, limited mobility. But she loves life. And so she's born in the midst of all of this happening in this church. And I go, God, where are you? Because I didn't sign up for this. You fast forward, I eventually leave that church after serving it for about 1.5 years and go to Friendly Temple, where I then go back to seminary at Covenant and graduate from Covenant in 2010. And then I started down the nonprofit world. And so me and my dad, when he was alive, because my dad was with me every step of the way when all of this is happening, we had this running joke. He would say, son, I worked a lot of overtime to help you pay for that degree. When are you going to get back to being an engineer? Make us some real money. And we would laugh about it. And I would say, Dad, I'm getting around to it. Give me a little time. And so my dad unexpectedly passed away in 2013. So he didn't get to see any of this that we get to do as a ministry today. He only got to hear my ideas and thoughts about it. And my dad was my biggest encourager. So when he passed away, it really did a number on me because when he passed away, he was in a doctor's office for a routine visit and his heart just stopped. And he collapsed in the doctor's office with the doctor in the office who happened to be a former ER trauma heart surgeon who began immediately doing CPR on him and could not get his heart back going. And so all of that's happening and our church is launching. And I'm going again, God, where are you in this? I share all those things tonight to say that in each one of those, God has uniquely done things to my heart and who I am and who my family is, and shaped us in such a way that gives us the compassion to serve in the neighborhood that we serve and serve the people that we serve, because we're not strangers to adversity, the unexpected, the tough questions about this good God and suffering, because we've experienced it all. And I know we're not unique. I bet I could give this mic and everybody could say something along those lines. I would say for me personally, I think that God did all of that to allow me to be humbled, to allow me to be in a position so that I would be willing and open to connecting with anybody. Because through each of those experiences, I met people from all ethnicities, faith backgrounds, and have found common ground and connected and been able to build lifelong relationships that probably never would have existed had none of those events happened. Now, I'm human. I wish there would have been a different way to get the same relationships and different things, but God saw it differently. And so me and my wife laugh now because when we were in school and met and first started dating, a lot of black students at Mizzou went to Second Baptist Church because it was close to campus, and they had great campus ministry. Well, my wife sung in the chorus. She sung there, and she sung in a black chorale chorus, part of the student union. And she would say, "You should come to church on Sunday and hear me sing." And I would say, "No, I'm not going to do that." I even went as far as to tell her one time that me and God had an arrangement. I don't go into his house, he doesn't come into my house. And so now, of course, you can imagine the jokes and the different things that I hear about being in and out of God's house. But again, we wouldn't be who we are as a couple, and our church wouldn't be what it is without all of that. So I feel blessed to be the pastor that I get to be. I feel blessed to be able to be a dad to a special needs child, where oftentimes in this world it's not set up for special needs children. I feel blessed, my son, who is now a freshman at Belmont University, doing well, who's an awesome big brother to his sister. They have their own special relationship. And if I could do anything over, I would say this on my faith journey. I do wish I would have taken more time with my brother. As I mentioned, he was murdered 2 years ago. He used to call me the little big brother because he sometimes would just be a bonehead and make poor decisions. And at times it frustrated me because I'm like, you're the older brother. You should be coaching me, not me coaching you. But it got to a point, certain lifestyle choices he made, that we had to put distance between each other. And so when he was shot and killed on Memorial Day in 2021, I knew that day would come potentially because of the lifestyle choice. I didn't want it to come. And yet it didn't change the grief, because he's still somebody that I love in spite of his choices. I say all that to say, I think, had not been through the things I've been through with God prior to him passing, I think I probably would have took his passing completely different. But I think the way God shaped my faith journey pushed me and put me in a place where I could look at it from the perspective that I did. So that's how God has uniquely, distinctly wired, moved, worked in my life. And I want to leave a little time because I'm over, and I apologize, and throw it open for any questions.
I'd like to know about the. Oh, I'm sorry. You should know this by now. I'd like to know a little bit about the hub and the kind of services-centric kind of approach you've taken to ministry.
Good question. So I'm gonna give you part of that answer, and then I'm gonna set you up because then you gotta come visit. So the hub is a former elementary school that had been shut down for 20 plus years that we bought the building, put about 1.5 million bucks into, renovated it to provide healthcare, educational opportunities, financial literacy, legal, arts, and tech. So we have a total of 10 partners in this building. St. Francis Community Services and Pathways to Progress helps with family stabilization. Maryville University, the Walker Scottish Rite Clinic, free speech therapy services for 2 to 6 year olds. Mercy Health Clinic. It's kind of a blend of a clinic / urgent care because you don't have urgent care in North City. Holland Law Firm offers free legal services. Good Shepherd Children and Family Services help at-risk families, especially with 5 and under who are potentially could lose child to step in. They help. The Ashtree Foundation that is out of Central Reform Congregation, Rabbi Susan. That's their foundation that helps with IDs and clinic and birth certificates and things of that nature. They have a spot. Pianos for People, training young people on piano. They donated to us a beautiful Steinway grand piano, and they teach young people music on it. First Bank, financial literacy and getting people second chance banking. We have a room called the Hub Tech Innovation Room, where we just ran our first cohort last year, where teach young people in the 6th to 8th grade how to build apps by coding and programming. So, and then our church. So all of that under one roof. We've maxed out the space. We just recently, and as recent as 3 weeks ago, signed a contract. Our architect is working on phase 2 because we have additional partners who want to connect, but we have no more space to rent. So it's a good problem, if you will, to have. And so we'll see where that goes, because this one, that will be way more expensive than what we did the first time. And I lost my hair on the first one. So we'll see what happens with part 2. No.
Catherine Matthews, Marianne Cook's friend.
Yes.
So I have this weird question in my head. Do you feel like you had to forgive God?
That's not a weird question at all, at least not to me. Yes. Not only forgive, but first be honest about how I really felt. Because I had these feelings, right? And I would say things here and there, but it was like my faith tradition as a child said, you don't talk to God like that. You don't pray like that. No, God is holy. Therefore, you cannot say those types of things. And so, because that was my faith tradition growing up, there was this infighting within, because, yeah, you can tell me I shouldn't say those things, but it don't stop me from feeling those things. And since you told me God knows everything anyway, see, that's what happens. I used to ask too many questions in church, and they would say, get out of here. But I had to come to the realization, if I'm going to move forward and trust God again, then I need to be honest and confess how I'm feeling and what I've been holding. Seek God for forgiveness, but also release God to be who I needed God to be. And I knew ultimately who he could be. Well, you closer to the mic, or we're going to do ladies first, or...
I was just wondering if you could explain to everyone about the project that you are about to begin.
The labor of love. So, one of the things in St. Louis, right, we have an F in terms of affordable housing spaces. This is well known. You add to that where our church sits in our corner of the Jeff Vanderloo has not seen a new house built in our immediate footprint, meaning within about an eighth of a mile or so of us, in 58 years. You add to that, if you look in the northern corridor between 2010 and 2020, only 19 new housing permits were pulled. Now, for many of you where you live, you get 19 permits in 2-3 months. 10 years, 19 permits. And so we wanted to create affordable housing. We wanted to create it in a space that, again, once upon a time, African Americans could not live in. And so the block where we're building new houses and have a groundbreaking coming up April 6th was a historic block because in 1949, the park near us with the swimming pool was a segregated park. The mayor in the city of St. Louis then tried to desegregate the park. He opened the park up to everybody. By 1 o'clock, many of the African Americans who lived on the other side of Grand show up at the park. They go to the pool. By 2 o'clock, a mob of white men show up. A riot and fight breaks out. It spreads throughout the neighborhood, and the National Guard is called in, and it ends on the 3700 block of Heber where we're building these new homes. The mayor that night then said, maybe we're better off separate, and puts back in the segregation order of the park. And the park stays segregated to 1966. So I mentioned my mom and dad growing up in the area. My dad told me stories of walking around that park, but he couldn't walk in it. He could not go to that pool until he was 21 years old. And so this housing project will build 15 new houses on that block, and then in that block and the block next to it, rehab an additional 10 or so. So it's gonna be total right at about 26 homes for sale, affordable housing, something that has not been for quite some time. So it's a big deal. Total price tag is right at $10 million. And I was sharing with Alan and David, navigating some of the politics. I'm not a politician. I don't do well with trying to cover stuff up. But yet, when you have these moments, you have to recognize who's who in the room and make sure they sit on separate sides. It's like me babysitting my nieces and nephews. You sit here, so everybody can get along. So just pray on April 6th, everybody gets along.
Are you still using the original church space?
Great question. Yes, it is literally right now under renovation, becoming
good.
a small chapel.
Good.
It's where we host our baptisms, smaller weddings, because in the hub, we have a 3,000 square foot auditorium that seats about 150 people. And sometimes people want a space for a wedding and they've got 10 people. Well, you don't need this. This fits you better. As well as some of the community stuff we do, like we open up our space for the block unit and other things.
Yeah.
They're a smaller group. They can be in the chapel.
Yeah, good.
Yeah, we're looking forward. It opens back up in roughly 10 days. It's getting paint, new floor, and some new AV. And then my son, who I mentioned, on Good Friday will be baptized there.
Oh, how cool.
Yeah.
I have another question. I personally have been very worried because of all the different things that come and interrupt this whole process. How do you deal with when it's just exasperating? You're trying to do God's work, but this happens and somebody gets shot and all this stuff.
Great question. I've had to learn, and this might not sound the greatest coming from a pastor, but it's the truth. I have learned there are some people who want our help and some people who don't. Getting to that realization has then freed me from feeling like and reminded me that I'm not the Savior, Jesus is. So when things happen back to back or things are slow to come together, like this Heber Homes project we've been working on since 2017.
Yes.
6 years to do something that we know is right. It'd be easy to just say, you know what? I can go do something else. But I can't go do something else. And so I've learned that scripture in Psalms 55 where it says, cast all your cares upon the Lord, for he will sustain you. I've learned the more I throw at God, the more peace I have. Doesn't mean I stop being concerned. It doesn't mean I don't stop using our voice and the leverage and the influence we have, but I recognize our limitations and also recognize that with God, things are a process. And that despite some of the horrible things that happen and or some of the delays that you go, this doesn't make sense, that is all a part of the story and the journey. Here's what I've learned. God loves to add sauce to a story. He does. He loves to add sauce and stir up the saga. He loves to press us to the brink before he says, okay, I'm going to open up the Red Sea and let you walk across on dry land. And so now I don't take those things as heavy as I used to because I understand it's part of the saga that God is stirring. Good question, though. Great question.
Is the structure of your church such that you get a lot of support? And how do you take time off? How do you heal?
Sure. Great question. So, for example, I was just off 5 days, including this past Sunday, while me and my wife hung out, went to a concert on Saturday. We forgot, though, that in addition to the concert we were going to downtown, that Toby Mac was downtown, and the Battle Hawks, and the soccer game. There were people everywhere. I'm riding in this Uber going, oh boy, this is a lot of people, which I think is good for downtown. But the way our church is structured, I do have some key volunteer leaders. I have some people that really love our family and make sure that we are cared for. So I can say, all right, I need to be away and be away when I need to. I step away when I need to, especially more so now with my son being in college. Like, I personally take on the breaks. I go get them, or I go to Nashville and hang out. You know, I step away. And part of that is because there were times when he was younger, I couldn't, not because of church, but because our daughter needed much more of my time and attention in terms of helping her with mobility and stuff like that. So now kind of on the back end, I get to do more. But yeah, I have some great people around me who help and allow me to rest when I want to rest and need to rest. And I'll say this, I have a wife who is determined that I won't die early. So if it seems like I'm trying to do too much or need a break, she's just going to call him and say, yeah, he won't be there. He needs a break. She likes me a little bit.
So talk about, you were called to be an engineer. So talk about how you're still working that into what you do today.
Yes, I'm trying to make my dad proud. A lot of engineering is about teaching you how to think critically. And to do ministry in an urban context like ours, you have to think critically and systematically. And so engineering skills that I learned helped me do that. Overseeing construction projects. A lot of the construction stuff we do, we oversee because it helps us keep costs down. But then it also allows us to employ people that we want to employ. So it allows us to give people from the neighborhood a chance at working and working around Jesus people. So that when they start talking about different things or have a challenge or an issue, they're talking to somebody who's going to give them a godly answer. We love that. So between the construction management, systematic stuff, that's how it weaves its way in. And without it, I don't think I could do what I do now. I don't. Because that background, I think sometimes is missing from church. I think techie people think church doesn't fit for them unless they're doing like sound. But it's like, no, that thinking and that thought and those systems are very much so needed in the kingdom. If not, God wouldn't have gave it to you.
I'll say it without the mic. What's your favorite Bible passage?
Oh. You know, I have two. Philippians 1:6 is one of them. He that has begun a good work in you. And in Greek, you know that you is plural. So it lets me know we're not alone and that God is still up to something and that he's at work in all of us. The other one for me is in Jeremiah 32, where Jeremiah gets the land from the cousin after they're in the exile. And Jeremiah 32, 16 and 17, it says, is anything too hard for God? Of course not, right? But there are times where I reread that, especially if things are looking challenging for my daughter and stuff like that, that remind me like, yeah, nothing's too hard for God. And reminds me of where to put my trust, not in me, but in him.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
It is always good to have.